Kethfer stood before the High Council of the Zephyrian Collective, his forearms folded behind his back in the traditional pose of respect. The massive chamber echoed with the voices of the 12 elders who ruled over 300 worlds. Their discussion had been going on for hours, but Kethfer knew better than to show any sign of impatience. "The humans are nothing more than primitives," Elder Vashtel declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived for 800 years. "They have barely mastered space travel, their weapons are crude, their ships are slow. Yet somehow they continue to resist the Hegemony Alliance." Elder Morden leaned forward on his floating throne. "This is precisely why we need to understand them. The Hegemony has superior technology, better training, and more ships. By all logical calculations, these humans should have been conquered within days. Instead, they have been fighting for months." Kethfer had spent most of his life studying alien species. He had observed the fierce Krallian warriors who fought with honor until death. He had watched the cunning Sylphic traders who could manipulate any situation to their advantage. He had documented the Hegemony's systematic approach to conquest, which had worked on 47 different worlds. But humans were different somehow, and nobody could explain why. "Kethfer of the Biology Division," Elder Vashtel called out. "You will go to observe these humans in their natural environment. We need to understand what makes them fight when they should surrender." "Yes, Elder," Kethfer replied, though he felt a strange unease about the assignment. "Which world should I observe?" "New Haven," Elder Morden answered. "It is a human colony world where the fighting is most intense. The Hegemony has been trying to capture it for 3 months. The humans refuse to give up, even though they are completely outnumbered." Kethfer nodded. He had read the reports about New Haven. The colony had started as a farming world, with about 2 million humans living simple lives. When the Hegemony invaded, most species would have surrendered immediately. Instead, the humans had organized a defense that was still holding. Strong months later. "Remember," Elder Vashtel continued, "you are there to observe only. Do not interfere with their conflict. We need pure data about how humans behave in warfare. The Council believes that understanding their weaknesses will help us plan for future encounters." The words felt heavy in the air. Kethfer knew what future encounters meant. The collective was already planning to conquer human space once they understood how to defeat them efficiently. It was the same pattern they had followed with dozens of other species. 3 days later, Kethfer found himself aboard a stealth scout ship approaching New Haven. The planet looked beautiful from space, with blue oceans and green continents that reminded him of the paradise worlds in the core systems. But as his ship entered the atmosphere, he could see the scars of war everywhere. Cities burned in the distance. Smoke rose from what had once been peaceful farmland. The ships of both sides filled the sky, engaged in constant battle. Kethfer activated his personal cloaking device and prepared to begin his observations. His first stop was the human military base near the colony's main city. The base was nothing impressive by galactic standards. The walls were made of simple concrete and metal. The weapons were basic projectile systems that any advanced civilization would consider ancient. The vehicles looked like they had been built in a factory, not grown in the biochambers that produce superior military equipment. But what caught Kethfer's attention was the activity. Humans moved with purpose through the base, carrying supplies, maintaining equipment, and preparing for battle. They showed no signs of the panic or despair that he had observed in other species facing impossible odds. He watched as a human officer walked among the soldiers. The nameplate on his uniform read Commander J. Morrison. The man was older than most of the others, with gray hair and lines on his face that spoke of many years of service. But his eyes were bright and determined. "Listen up, Marines," Morrison called out to a group of soldiers. "Intel reports that the Hegemony is planning another major assault tomorrow. They have twice as many ships as we do, and their ground forces outnumber us 3-1. Kethfer expected to see fear in the faces of the soldiers. Instead, he saw something that puzzled him. The humans looked grim, but not defeated. They listened to their commander with the same attention they might give to a weather report. "We have been through worse," Morrison continued. "Remember what we are fighting for. Every minute we hold this line, more civilians get evacuated to safety. Every hegemony ship we destroy here is one less ship that can attack Earth or Mars or any of the other colonies. The soldiers nodded. A few of them smiled. Kethver could not understand their reaction. These humans were about to face superior enemies in a battle they could not win, yet they seemed almost eager to fight. As the meeting broke up, Kethver followed Morrison to the command center. The building was simple but functional, filled with communication equipment and tactical displays. Officers and enlisted personnel worked together, sharing information and coordinating defensive preparations. Kethver settled into a corner, where he could observe without being detected. He opened his recording device and began his first report. Day 1 of human observation, he spoke quietly into the device. Subject species shows unusual behavior patterns. Despite facing overwhelming odds, they continue military preparations without visible signs of stress or panic. Further observation required to understand this anomaly. He had no idea that by the end of his mission he would wish he had never come to this world at all. Kethver woke to the sound of explosions in the distance. The human base was already buzzing with activity, even though the sun had not yet risen. He watched through his cloaking device as soldiers ran to their positions carrying weapons and supplies. That looked primitive compared to what he was used to, seeing the hegemony attack had begun earlier than expected. Commander Morrison stood in the command center giving orders to his officers, while reports came in from all sectors of the colony. The news was not good for the humans. The enemy had landed forces in 3 different locations and their ships were bombing the main city. Sir, we have civilian casualties at the hospital, reported a young officer whose nameplate read Lieutenant. Davis, the building took a direct hit and half of it is gone, Morrison nodded grimly. Send medical teams immediately. Get every ambulance we have to that location. Kethver followed the medical teams as they rushed toward the damaged hospital. The scene that greeted them was chaos. People were trapped under collapsed walls. Others lay bleeding in the streets. The human medical personnel immediately began working to save lives, but they were clearly overwhelmed. That was when Kethver saw something that made him stop and stare. A sergeant with the name Carter on her uniform was organizing the rescue efforts. She moved through the rubble without any regard for her own safety, pulling injured civilians to safety. Her uniform was torn and she was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but she kept working. Brooks, get over here, she called to another soldier. Help me lift this beam. There is someone trapped underneath. Private Brooks rushed over and together they lifted a heavy piece of concrete that would have taken special equipment to move safely. As soon as they freed the trapped person, Sergeant Carter was already moving to the next victim. Kethver watched this behavior with growing confusion. In his experience, soldiers were trained to fight other soldiers, not to risk their lives for civilians who contributed nothing to the war effort. Yet here was Carter, repeatedly putting herself in danger to save people who could not help the human military in any way. Why does she do this? Kethver spoke into his recording device. The logical action would be to focus on military objectives. Saving civilians does not improve their tactical position. The rescue efforts continued for hours. Carter and her team pulled dozens of people from the wreckage. They worked without rest, even as more explosions shook the ground around them. When a hegemony fighter flew overhead, strafing the area with weapons fire, Carter threw herself over a wounded child to protect him from the attack. Kethver had studied many species in wartime, but he had never seen anything like this. Most civilizations would abandon non-combatants to focus on military survival. These humans seemed to consider civilian protection as important as winning battles. Later that day, he observed Lieutenant Colonel Patterson coordinating the overall defense from the command center. She was simultaneously managing troop movements and organizing evacuation routes for refugees. Her staff worked around the clock to balance military needs with civilian welfare. Colonel, we have transport ships ready to evacuate more civilians, an aide reported. But we need fighter escorts and we are running low on fuel. Patterson studied the tactical display for a moment. Take 2 squadrons from the northern sector. Give the transports whatever protection they need. The civilians are our priority. But Colonel, that will leave the northern defenses weakened. I know, Patterson replied, but we are not here to hold territory. We are here to protect lives. Do it. Kethver recorded this exchange with growing bewilderment. The humans were making tactical decisions that weakened their military position in order to save non-combatants. This went against every principle of warfare he had learned as the day wore on. The fighting intensified. The hegemony forces pushed deeper into the colony and human casualties mounted, yet the behavior Kethver observed remained consistent. Human soldiers continued to risk their lives for civilians even when it made no strategic sense. He watched as medics ran through enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers. He saw engineers work to repair power systems that served hospitals rather than military installations, he observed. Pilots fly dangerous missions to evacuate civilians from combat zones. One incident particularly puzzled him. A supply convoy was attacked by hegemony forces while carrying medical supplies to a refugee camp. The logical response would have been to abandon the supplies and save the vehicles and personnel instead. The human drivers stayed with their cargo and fought off the attack, even though several of them were killed in the process. The supplies reached the refugee camp, Kethver recorded that evening, but the cost was 3 human lives and 2 destroyed vehicles. The tactical benefit was minimal, yet they considered it a successful mission. Dr. Foster, the civilian physician he had noticed earlier, was still working at the makeshift hospital she had established in the bombed school. She had been offered evacuation multiple times but refused to leave her patients. "Doctor, you need to get some rest," a nurse told her. "You have been working for 18 hours straight. There will be time to rest when everyone is safe," Dr. Foster replied as she continued treating a wounded soldier. "Right now, these people need me." Kethver watched her work with increasing unease. She treated both human and enemy wounded with the same level of care. When a captured hegemony soldier was brought in with severe injuries, she immediately began working to save his life. "Why do you help the enemy?" Kethver whispered to himself. "They are trying to kill you," but Dr. Foster continued her work. As if the question had never occurred to her, she spent hours performing surgery on the enemy soldier using precious medical supplies that could have been used on humans. Instead, as night fell over New Haven, Kethver found himself more confused. And when he had arrived, the human behavior he was observing did not match any of the patterns he had studied in other species. They seemed to be fighting for something beyond simple survival, but he could not understand what it was he made his. Second, report to the High Council that night trying to explain what he had witnessed. Human military doctrine appears to prioritize civilian welfare over tactical advantage. He said, "They consistently make decisions that weaken their position. In order to protect non-combatants, this behavior extends to treating enemy casualties. I require more time to understand these patterns." The response from the council was immediate and clear. "Continue observing until you can explain this anomaly." Kethver settled in for what he suspected would be a long and disturbing assignment. The third day of observation brought something that made Kethver question everything he thought he knew about warfare. Captain Rodriguez gathered his team in the abandoned warehouse just after midnight. The humans looked tired and dirty, but their eyes held a strange light that Kethver had never seen before. "Listen up, people," Rodriguez said quietly to his squad. "Intelligence says the hegemony has a major supply depot about 5 miles north of here. If we can take it out, we can slow down their advance for maybe 2 days. Corporal Santos studied the rough map Rodriguez had drawn on the concrete floor. "Sir, that depot is protected by at least 50 enemy soldiers and automated defense systems. We have 8 people and basic weapons." "I know the odds," Rodriguez replied, "but 2 days might be enough time to evacuate another 1,000 civilians from the southern districts. Are you all in?" Every member of the squad nodded without hesitation. Kethver watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. These humans were volunteering for what appeared to be a suicide mission just to buy time for people they did not even know. The squad prepared for their mission with careful precision, but their equipment was laughably primitive by galactic standards. They had explosive devices made from farming chemicals and detonators, built from communication equipment. Private Miller showed the others how to modify their basic rifles to fire armor-piercing rounds using materials scavenged from destroyed vehicles. "This is insane," Kethver whispered into his recording device. "They are attacking a fortified position with improvised weapons and no air support, yet they act as if this is a routine operation." What happened next defied everything Kethver had learned about military tactics. Rodriguez led his team through the darkness using paths that avoided enemy patrols. They moved like ghosts through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate without detection equipment. When they reached the supply depot, Rodriguez split his small force into even smaller groups. Santos and Miller went to the fuel storage area, while Rodriguez and 2 others targeted the ammunition bunkers. The remaining soldiers created diversions on The opposite side of the compound. The attack began with a series of small explosions that confused the hegemony defenders. They expected a major assault from one direction, but instead faced multiple small threats from all around the depot. By the time they realized what was happening, the humans had already destroyed half of their supplicator. Watched from a safe distance as the human soldiers improvised tactics in real time. When their original plan failed, Rodriguez immediately adapted, creating new objectives based on what they found. Santos discovered that the depot also contained medical supplies meant for enemy troops. Instead of just destroying them, she and Miller loaded everything they could carry onto stolen enemy vehicles. "We can use these for our own wounded," Santos explained to Rodriguez over their communication system, "and maybe trade some to the civilian doctors." The raid lasted only 30 minutes, but the damage was enormous. The hegemony lost enough supplies to delay their advance for at least a week. But what impressed Kethver most was how the humans had accomplished this. The squad had used creativity and adaptability to overcome superior technology and number. Staff Sergeant Hughes provided another example of human resourcefulness. That same day, the communication systems at the base had been damaged by enemy bombing and replacement parts were not available. Hughes gathered broken equipment from across the colony and somehow built a working communication network from the scraps. "How did you know this would work?" Commander Morrison asked as Hughes tested the improvised system. "I did not know, sir," Hughes replied. "But we needed communication, so I had to try something. The worst that could happen was failure, and we already had that," Kethver recorded. Hughes working for hours with tools that were barely adequate for the task. The human took apart dozens of devices and combined their components in ways that the original manufacturers had never intended, yet somehow the result was a communication system that worked better than what they had before. Dr. Foster continued to puzzle Kethver with her dedication to treating everyone regardless of their side in the conflict. Her makeshift hospital had become a refuge for both human and enemy wounded. She had somehow convinced the fighting forces on both sides to respect the medical facility as neutral ground. "Doctor, why do you help the enemy soldiers?" a young Marine asked her as she worked on a hegemony officer who had been brought in with severe injuries. "Because they are hurt and I am a doctor," Foster replied simply. "When someone is wounded, they stop being the enemy and become my patient." The Marine looked confused but nodded and continued helping her with the surgery. Kethver watched this interaction with growing unease. The human concept of medical neutrality was completely foreign to him. Most species would let enemy wounded die or use them for information. That evening, Kethver observed something that disturbed him even more. A group of human soldiers had captured several enemy troops during a patrol. Instead of interrogating them or treating them as prisoners, the humans shared their food and medical supplies with the captives. "Why do you feed us?" one of the hegemony soldiers asked his captors. "We would not do the same for you." "Maybe not," replied the human guard, "but we are not you. We treat prisoners the way we would want to be treated." The captured soldiers seemed as confused by this behavior as Kethver was. In his experience, prisoners were tools to be used for information or leverage. These humans appeared to consider them as people who deserved basic dignity. As the night wore on, Kethver made his third report to the High Council. His words came slowly as he struggled to explain what he had witnessed. Human combat effectiveness appears to derive from adaptability and creative problem-solving rather than superior technology. He said, "They modify equipment in real time and develop new tactics during battle. They also demonstrate unprecedented concern for enemy welfare, which may be a weakness to exploit." But even as he spoke those words, Kethver was beginning to suspect that what he was observing was not weakness at all. It was something else entirely, something that made these humans far more dangerous than any enemy the galaxy had ever seen. The Council would want concrete answers soon, and Kethver was beginning to fear what those answers might reveal about the true nature of humanity. The morning of the fourth day brought news that made even Kethver feel dread. The hegemony had assembled their largest force yet for what they called the final assault. Commander Morrison stood before his officers in the command center while tactical displays showed the overwhelming enemy numbers approaching the colony. "Gentlemen and ladies," Morrison said calmly, "we are looking at 20,000 enemy troops supported by air power and heavy armor. We have about 3,000 defenders left, and most of our equipment is damaged or destroyed." Colonel Grant leaned forward over the tactical display. "Sir, recommend we begin full evacuation procedures. We cannot hold against those numbers." Morrison nodded slowly. How many civilians are still in the evacuation zones? About 15,000, Sir. Lieutenant Davis replied. The transport ships can take maybe 5,000 in the next 6 hours. Then we hold for 6 hours, Morrison said simply. After that, we buy as much time as we can. For the remaining civilians, Kethver watched the faces of the human officers as they absorbed this information. They all understood what Morrison was really saying. They were going to die here, but instead of panic or despair, he saw something that made his skin crawl with unease. He saw acceptance and determination. The preparations began immediately, Master Sergeant. Taylor took her squad to the main bridge that crossed the river running through the colony. This bridge was the key to the human defensive position. If it fell, the enemy could pour into the civilian areas unopposed. How long do we need to hold this position? Corporal White asked as they set up their defensive positions. As long as it takes, Taylor replied. The civilians are counting on us. Private Murphy checked her weapon and looked at the approaching enemy forces. Sarge, there are hundreds of them coming this way. We have 12 people. Then we make every shot count, Taylor said. Remember what we are fighting for. Kethver positioned himself where he could observe the bridge defense. He had studied military history from across the galaxy, but he had never seen anything like what was about to happen. The humans were preparing to face impossible odds with the same calm professionalism they might show during a training exercise. The enemy attack began with artillery that shook the ground for miles around. The human positions were hammered by explosions that should have broken any defensive line, but when the bombardment ended, Taylor and her squad were still there, battered, but ready to fight. The first wave of enemy troops advanced across the bridge. Taylor waited until they were halfway across before giving the order to fire. The human weapons were primitive, but they were accurate. The enemy advance slowed as soldiers fell, but more kept coming, reloading. White called out as he changed the power cell in his rifle. "Cover him," Taylor shouted as she continued firing. The battle turned into a nightmare of noise and violence. Enemy soldiers fell, but others took their place. The humans fought with desperate efficiency, making every shot count because they knew ammunition was limited. Kethver watched Private Murphy continue fighting even after she had been wounded by shrapnel from an enemy grenade. She had tied a bandage around her arm and kept firing as if nothing had happened. When White was hit by enemy fire, she dragged him to cover and continued his position. "Why do they not retreat?" Kethver spoke into his recording device. "They are clearly going to be overrun." But the humans held their ground for hours. The enemy threw wave after wave of troops at the bridge, but could not break through. The human defenders grew fewer as the day wore on, but those who remained fought with increasing desperation. Above the ground battle, Major Parker flew his damaged fighter on another mission to support the bridge defenders. His aircraft had been hit multiple times and the ejection system was not working, but he kept flying. Captain Lane stayed with him even though her own aircraft was in better condition. "Parker, your plane is falling apart," Lane said over the radio. "You need to land." "Negative," Parker replied. "The ground troops need air support. I can give them one more pass." "Your engines are smoking and your weapons are almost empty. Then I better make this one count." Kethver watched the two human aircraft make their final attack run against the enemy forces massed at the bridge. Parker's fighter was trailing smoke and flying unsteadily, but he lined up perfectly for his weapon. Lane stayed beside him, providing cover even though she could have escaped to safety. Attack broke up the enemy formation and bought the bridge defenders precious time, but Parker's aircraft finally gave up. He tried to guide it away from the civilian areas as it crashed. Lane circled the wreckage site until enemy fire forced her to retreat back at the bridge. Taylor had been wounded, but she continued commanding her remaining soldiers. The enemy was massing for another assault, and she knew this would be the final one. "Listen up," she called to her remaining troops. "We have held this bridge for 18 hours, the last transport ship should be launching soon. We just need to hold a little longer." Corporal White was badly wounded, but still fighting. "How much longer, Sarge?" "Until they stop coming or we stop them," Taylor replied. The final enemy assault came with everything. They had tanks rolled onto the bridge, supported by hundreds of infantry. The human position was hammered by weapons fire from all directions. But Taylor and her squad kept fighting. When the ammunition ran low, they used improvised explosives. When those were gone, they fought with whatever weapons they could find. The enemy advance slowed to a crawl as each step forward cost them dearly. Finally, when only Taylor and two others remained alive, they began a fighting withdrawal. They moved from position to position, making the enemy pay for every meter of ground, but they were buying time for something more important than territory. As the sun set over New Haven, the last civilian transport ship lifted off from the spaceport. The bridge had fallen, but the 15,000 civilians were safe. Taylor and her squad had held long. Inakathver watched the aftermath with growing horror. The human defenders had been wiped out, but they had accomplished their impossible mission. The enemy had won the battle, but at such a cost that their advance had been delayed by days. They chose to die, Kethver whispered to himself. They chose to die for people they did not even know. This was not the behavior of any species he had ever studied. This was something entirely different, and it frightened him more than any weapon he had ever encountered. The fifth day dawned with the sound of heavy engines in the atmosphere. The massive human battleship USS Determination dropped out of hyperspace above New Haven, followed by smaller escort vessels. Kethver watched from his hidden position as the human defenders cheered at the sight of their reinforcements. Admiral Collins stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying the tactical situation below. The colony was in ruins and enemy forces controlled most of the planet, but thousands of human civilians were still alive because of the sacrifices made by the defenders. Collins knew his fleet was still outnumbered, but that had never stopped humans before. Admiral, we have enemy capital ships moving to intercept us, reported his tactical officer. They have twice our firepower and 3 times our numbers. Then we better be 3 times smarter, Collins replied. Signal all ships prepare for attack pattern Delta. Kethver had access to both human and hegemony communications, so he could monitor the battle from both perspectives. The enemy commanders were confident that their superior numbers would ensure victory. They had defeated the human ground forces, and now they would finish off the rescue fleet, but General Hayes had other plans. She had arrived with the fleet carrying fresh troops and a strategy that made no sense to anyone watching. Colonel Jackson received his orders and immediately began protesting. General, you want me to attack their main formation with my armored division, Jackson said over the communication system. Sir, we will be completely surrounded. That is the idea, Colonel, Hayes replied. While you keep their attention, Major Ross will coordinate airstrikes on their rear positions. We are going to hit them everywhere at once. General, that means accepting heavy casualties in every sector. Yes, it does, Colonel, but that is how we win. Kethver listened to this exchange with growing bewilderment. The human strategy appeared to be tactical suicide. They were planning to attack superior forces simultaneously on multiple fronts, which would result in massive casualties. But somehow the human officers accepted these orders without question. The battle began with Jackson's armored division charging directly into the center of the enemy formation. His tanks were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with desperate courage. Tank after tank was destroyed, but the survivors kept advancing. Jackson, your division is being wiped out. Came the radio call from headquarters. Do you need to withdraw? Negative, Jackson replied as his own tank took heavy damage. We are exactly where we need to be. Keep those airstrikes coming. Major Ross coordinated the air attacks from her command post. Even as enemy artillery targeted her position, she called in strikes on her own location to break up enemy formations that were threatening to overrun the human advance. Ross, your position is being overrun, Colonel Jackson reported. Get out of there. Cannot do that, sir, Ross replied. I can see the enemy movements from here. If I leave now, the airstrikes will not be effective. She stayed at her post directing aircraft until the very last moment when enemy troops finally reached her command post. She had already called in an airstrike on her own position. The explosion killed her, but it also destroyed the enemy formation that had been advancing on the human flank. Sergeant Major King led his squad of walking wounded in an assault on an enemy command post. His men were barely able to fight, but they had volunteered for the mission anyway. King himself had been wounded in the earlier fighting, but he refused medical treatment. Sir, you should be in a hospital, one of his soldiers said as they prepared for the attack. I will go to the hospital after we take that command post, King replied. Right now, my place is here with you. The assault succeeded, but at enormous cost. King and half his squad were killed, but the enemy command structure was disrupted just long enough for the main attack to succeed. Kethver watched this pattern repeat across the entire battlefield. Human units accepted impossible missions and suffered terrible casualties, but somehow their strategy worked. The enemy was being defeated not through superior technology or numbers, but through sheer determination to win regardless of the cost. The space battle above the planet followed the same Pattern Admiral Collins threw his ships at the enemy fleet. In attacks that should have failed, his captains understood that they were probably going to die, but they followed their orders anyway. "Admiral, we have lost half our escort ships," reported the tactical officer. "The enemy is moving to surround us." "Then we go right through them," Collins replied. "All ships full speed ahead. Target their flagship." The USS Determination charged directly into the enemy formation, her guns blazing at every target. The ship took massive damage but kept fighting her crew. Worked to repair systems even as explosions rocked the vessel. "Sir, the main reactor is failing," came the report from engineering. "We need to shut down all non-essential systems." "Negative," Collins replied. "Keep everything running as long as possible. We only need to last a few more minutes." The battleship continued fighting even as her hull was breached in multiple places. Her crew stayed at their posts, knowing that abandoning their duties meant death for everyone. Collins remained on the bridge, coordinating the battle even as the ship shook apart around him. Finally, the enemy flagship was destroyed and the remaining hegemony vessels began to retreat. The human fleet had won, but at terrible cost. Most of their ships were damaged beyond repair, and thousands of crew members were dead. The victory on the ground was complete. The enemy forces that had seemed so powerful just hours before were now retreating in disorder. The human counterattack had succeeded through tactics that defied all military logic. HFY made his fifth report to the High Council that night, but his words came slowly as he struggled to understand what he had witnessed. Human military doctrine appears to be based on accepting casualties that other species would consider unacceptable, he said. They achieve victory through willingness to sacrifice rather than superior strategy or technology. This behavior extends to all levels of command, from individual soldiers to fleet admirals. He paused before continuing, "I am beginning to suspect that what I initially considered to be tactical weakness may actually be their greatest strength. They fight as if death is preferable to defeat." The council demanded more specific information about human psychology, but HFY was no longer sure he wanted to provide it. What he was observing was not just military tactics, but something fundamental about human nature itself, something that made them unlike any species he had ever encountered, something that made them terrifying. The sixth day brought something that shook HFY to his core. The human victory had come at a price that would have destroyed any other species he had studied. The casualty reports were staggering. Nearly half of the human defenders were dead or wounded. Their equipment was mostly destroyed and their colony lay in ruins. But instead of celebrating their victory, the humans did something that made HFY question everything he thought he knew about warfare. Lieutenant Commander Williams organized the search and rescue operations with the same efficiency she had shown during the battle, but now she was looking for survivors from both sides. Her team searched through the wreckage of the colony, pulling out wounded humans and enemy soldiers with equal care. "Commander, we found a group of hegemony soldiers trapped in that collapsed building," reported one of her search teams. "They are badly injured but still alive. Get them out," Williams ordered. "Medical teams are standing by." HFY watched as human soldiers risked their lives to save the same enemy troops who had been trying to kill them just hours before. The humans worked for hours to free the trapped soldiers using equipment that was needed for their own reconstruction. Efforts. Chaplain Martinez moved through the temporary medical facilities, providing comfort to the wounded and dying. He spoke with human and enemy soldiers alike, offering the same gentle words to everyone regardless of which side they had fought. "For why do you help us?" a wounded hegemony officer asked Martinez. "We came here to conquer your world because you are hurt and far from home," Martinez replied. "Everyone deserves comfort in their final moments." The chaplain stayed with the dying officer until the end, holding his hand and speaking softly. Even though they had been enemies, the sight of this made HFY feel physically ill. He had never witnessed anything like this level of compassion toward defeated enemies. Captain Clark supervised the distribution of supplies to the refugee camps that had been established around the colony. The camps held both human civilians and captured enemy soldiers, but Clark made sure that everyone received the same level of care. "Sir, we are running low on medical supplies," his aide reported. "Should we prioritize our own wounded?" "No," Clark replied. "Everyone gets treated equally. We are not animals." HFY watched as human medical personnel worked tirelessly to save the lives of soldiers who had been shooting at them earlier that morning. Dr. Foster continued her work treating patients without asking which side they had fought for. She performed surgery on enemy soldiers using the same skill and care she showed to humans. Dr. Why do you waste supplies on the enemy? A young nurse asked as Foster worked to save a hegemony soldier who had been critically wounded. Because he is someone's son, Foster replied. Somewhere in the galaxy there is a family waiting for him to come home. They love him just as much as our families love us. The nurse looked confused but continued helping with the surgery. Foster worked for 6 hours to save the enemy soldier's life using precious medical supplies that were desperately needed. For human casualties, Nurse Commander Parker coordinated the medical efforts across the entire colony. She had been working without rest since the battle, began treating hundreds of wounded from both sides. Her dedication to saving lives extended. To everyone, regardless of their species or allegiance, Commander, you need to rest, one of her staff said. You have been working for 24 hours straight. There will be time to rest when everyone is stable. Parker replied, right now, people. Need help? She continued working even as she swayed from exhaustion. Her staff had to physically support her as she moved from patient to patient, but she refused to leave her. What disturbed Kethver most was the way the humans mourned their enemies. The same soldiers who had fought desperately to defend their colony now stood over the graves of enemy dead with the same respect they showed their own fallen. They fought bravely, Commander Morrison said at a memorial service for both human and enemy casualties. They were our enemies, but they were also soldiers doing their duty. We honor their sacrifice. Kethver recorded this ceremony with growing unease. The humans were treating their defeated enemies with more respect than most species showed their own allies. This was not the behavior of a primitive warlike race. This was something entirely different. The reconstruction efforts showed the same pattern. Human engineers worked to rebuild hospitals and schools before repairing military installations. They prioritized civilian needs over their own defensive requirements, even though another attack was possible. Sir, we should rebuild the defensive perimeter first, advised Colonel Grunt. The enemy might return. The children need schools and the sick need hospitals, Morrison replied. We will rebuild the defenses, but not at the expense of civilian needs. Kethver watched human soldiers work side by side with former enemies to rebuild the colony-captured hegemony. Troops who had been offered the chance to help with reconstruction worked alongside the humans who had defeated them. Why do you trust us? A captured enemy soldier asked. Captain Clark, we might try to escape or sabotage your work, because everyone deserves a chance to do something good, Clark replied. The war is over. You can choose to help rebuild or sit in a cell. The choice is yours. Most of the captured soldiers chose to help. Some of them worked harder than the humans to repair the damage. Their own forces had caused the sight of former enemies working together to rebuild what had been destroyed made Kethver feel sick with confusion as the day ended. Kethver made his 6th report to the High Council. His words came slowly as he struggled to find the right language to describe what he had witnessed. Human post-combat behavior defies all known patterns of warfare, he said. They treat defeated enemies with the same care they show their own casualties. They prioritize civilian welfare over military necessity. Even after achieving victory, this behavior suggests a fundamental difference in their approach to conflict. He paused before adding, I am beginning to suspect that humans do not fight wars the way other species. Do they fight for principles that extend beyond victory or defeat? The council response was immediate and demanding. They wanted specific information about human weaknesses that could be exploited in future conflicts, but Kethver was no longer sure that humans had the kind of weaknesses the council was looking for. What he was observing was not weakness at all. It was something that made humans more dangerous than any enemy the galaxy had ever faced.